Hello, this is Sondra, Oster, Baras, bringing you a few words of Bible from the heart of Biblical Israel. This week's Torah portion is Devarim. It's the first chapters of the book of Deuteronomy. And in starting Deuteronomy, we are really moving into a whole different book. If the first four books of the Bible were basically the story of the Genesis of the world, the beginning, creation, through the foundings and beginnings of the nation of Israel, up into the point at the end of last week's Torah portion, at the end of the book of Numbers, the nation of Israel is poised on the edge of the Jordan, and they are ready to cross into the land of Israel. The entire book of Deuteronomy takes place within the last few weeks of Moses' life, and it is Moses' parting messages to the nation before he passes away and before they cross the Jordan. And so unlike the first four books, which are written in third person, most of the book of Deuteronomy is first person. It is Moses saying to you, second person, I, Moses, am saying to you, this is my message, these are my instructions, these are my warnings, etc. So it's very important to realize that, because there are some differences in the treatment of the same stories, the way they are treated, for example, in Exodus or in Numbers, and the way they are treated here in Deuteronomy. I'd like to focus on one small story and one small verse in this week's chapter. The first story one of the first stories that Moses refers to at the beginning of his speech is what we call a historical speech. He's basically recapping the events since they left Egypt until that very day. And he's recapping the events that have to do with sending the spies or the scouts to go out to the land of Israel and the terrible things that ensued. We'll recall that when they came back with a terrible report. They came back and said, we cannot go up to the land. And as a result, the nation was punished, and they spent 38 more years wandering in the desert. And it's only Joshua and Caleb of that entire generation that is going to be able to go into the land of Israel. So he recaps that. He tells it a little differently, and of course he tells it very briefly, but he says as follows in verse 26, you refused to go up, and you rebelled against the word of the Lord your God. And then he refers to about that they were angry, and they believed that they accused God of hating them, bringing us out to the land from the land, handing us over to the Amorites, etc. But this word, you rebelled, in Hebrew vatamru, the root of that word is meri, and it refers to rebellion. Okay. And it's very interesting, because this word, the use of this word with this root, meri, rebellion, is something we do not see at all in the original story of the spies. In fact, we almost don't see it until very recently, and that's what we're going to check on now. But if you go to the original story of the spies, there's a lot of discussion of complaints. We have at the very end, God speaks in Numbers chapter 14, we see in verse 27, how much longer shall that wicked community complain and utter complaints against me? And he uses the word of complaint. This I see in some of the translations is muttering, but it's complaints. And there's a lot of that word complaint is repeated over and over again. And in fact, in most of the stories in the book of Numbers, when we see the nation of Israel over and over again complaining about something, that's the word that's using. We're not seeing the word rebellion, we're seeing the word complaints. And at the very at the very end of the story, it is God that really says that they're, as I showed you here, that they're complaining. That this is how he defines them. They're complaining. He doesn't say they are rebels. Okay. When does this begin to change? It begins to change with the story of Korach. Now, Korach, if you think about it, is a classic story of rebellion. It begins with Korach coming up with a whole gang of people up against Moses and Aaron and basically saying to them, who made you the leader? we're just as good as you are. That is a classic statement of rebellion. Rebellion against, not necessarily against God, but in the first instance, rebellion against the leadership. They want to replace the leadership. Okay, and we have, different conversation back and forth. But look what happens at the very end when God is defining what it is they did. He is saying, and this is in Numbers chapter 17, verse 25. He says, put Aaron's staff back before the pack to be kept as a lesson to rebels. Okay, a lesson to rebels. And so it's very clear that in this, for the first time, okay, we see the language of rebellion, even though throughout the discussion here it's complaints, it's charges, it's accusations, it's more words like that. But when God is summarizing this and saying this is what we're going to have to do from now on, he's talking about it as a rebellion. These were rebels, okay? Of course, when we really see the word rebels being used is in the story of bringing water from the rock. And there, Moses turns to the nation with great anger. And he says to them, now listen up here, you rebels. Okay? And that, in fact, there are some who interpret, when people try to understand what exactly was the sin of Moses and Aaron, that God was so angry with them afterwards. One of the interpretations is that this anger that we see reflected here. Why did Moses suddenly lash out at the nation and say, oh, you rebels? Okay? Where's that coming from? And again, when we see it here in Moses' recap of this incident, which happens it's some time after the rebellion of Korach. The rebellion of Korach, sin of the spies, all these things happened in the second year. We are now in the 40th year, so it's 38 years later. The Korach and the spies happened 38 years earlier. But when Moses speaks to the nation with the bringing water from the rock, this is a few weeks earlier. And he's referring to them as rebels. And I think what has happened basically is, first of all, I see Korach as a watershed event. If the story of the spies, the way it was told in its place 38 years earlier, there's no language of rebellion. Just a bit later than that, not long after that, we have the rebellion of Korach, which indeed was a rebellion. And I think that becomes a watershed event. That really is a rebellion, okay? Moses, though, that experience of having gone through this direct attack on his leadership, changes the way he sees things, and he starts to view all the complaints, all that has happened until that point with a lens of rebellion, not just a lens of complaint. And therefore, when we're coming now to the final weeks, months of his life, both in the situation of hitting the rock and what he says to the nation, listen here, you rebels, and right here, when he reinterprets the whole sin of the spies and casts it in terms of rebellion. This is what we saw in the original story in the book of Numbers. We saw it as being a lack of faith, a weakness on the part of the nation, a lack of faith. They didn't believe that God would help them in the challenges they will surely face as they enter the land of Israel. Here, we see Moses is recasting this as a rebellion against God in this situation. And so, to me, it's a very interesting situation because the Moses we are meeting now in the 40th year is a slightly different Moses. He has gone through a great deal with this nation. I think he has far less patience for them, even though this is a new generation, far less patience. And there are those who say that for that reason, more than any other reason, Moses was not the right person to take them into the land of Israel. He had lost patience with them. He viewed them all as rebels, even when they were not necessarily rebels. His perspective had switched. For all his devotion, for all his love of the nation, for all his devotion to God, extreme loyalty to God, he was not the right man to lead them into the nation. And this few little words that we see here in his last speech, and you rebelled against the word of the Lord your God, says so much about where Moses is today. Have a wonderful Shabbat. Shabbat Shalom.
Okay. I hope you enjoyed that film.
And we have lots more film content and emails and articles that I'm sure you will enjoy as well. Check out our website at CFOIC.com and subscribe to our newsletter. You can do that right from the homepage. I know you will really enjoy the content that will land in your inbox on a regular basis. Hope to see you soon.